My team is responsible for ensuring the fact that the university is a happy place to be. And folks always ask me, like, what do you do? And I'm like, my job is to make the students happy and successful. So very similar to, I'm pretty sure your HR administration or your people and culture administration at George Brown, they have the exact same responsibility to making sure that you are happy and successful. And to do that, we look at data in the work that we're doing in order to move that forward. And so for today's session, I do have a bunch of slides and we will go through them. You will get a copy of them. But most importantly, I want it to be as inclusive as possible. If you have questions, please feel free to utilize the chat and put them in the chat. We will go through them. If at any point in time you have a question that you want to be answered, please feel free to put up your hand. I'm happy to also stop and engage in conversation because you don't want to listen to me all day long. I will deeply apologize. I had all intentions of creating a Slido, but as I was putting this together, there are points in this conversation that we are going to have a conversation. And so again, just if you have anything that you'd want to share, please feel free. You can either come off of mute and we'll facilitate that. Or you can type your responses into the chat because we're hoping to make this as interactive as possible. The other piece of this is I will pre-warn you. I get so excited about the topics that I speak about, especially about diversity, equity, inclusion, and about data and how to use it in HR or in business. And so for those of you that are on this call that are in HR, yay, because I wish I had somebody that talked about the importance of data when I was there. But what I was supposed to be saying is I talk really fast. I talk fast naturally. I talk even faster when I get excited. And so if at any point in time you need me to slow down, please feel free to just put it in the chat and let me know. If I need to go over anything, again, just please advise me. I will not be offended. And with that, I think I'm going to share my screen.
It's
All right.
perfect now.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. All right. So welcome to this afternoon. I hope you all are excited to talk about data. The part of the work that I had done this after, or prepare for this afternoon, was to talk to Umana and understand kind of what are some of the things that you would be wanting to hear more about. And so this is where we landed. It doesn't mean it covers everything. Some of the things that we thought you would want to hear about today was how does data analytics impact the hiring side of this? How do we use data in human resources or in business? How does bias impact data collection and data analysis? And how does bias affect data modeling? And so if anything, when I leave or when you leave today, we should have covered these four things to be mildly successful. And so if I dive right into things, the first part of this was how can data analytics be leveraged in organizations? Before I even go to the next slide, interaction activity number one, I want anybody that has the ability to do so in the chats to type in, how do you think data analytics can be leveraged in an organization? So besides an HR, anybody, somebody can put something in the chat. To inform strategy, Karen, that's correct. Track progress. Yep. One of the famous sayings is I believe it was Henry Ford, I want to say, but I could be wrong. You can't, what you don't measure, you can't, or what you don't track, you cannot measure, and therefore you cannot improve. Amazing. So 100%, this is how data can be used. So we've got tracking and we've got data collection and strategy and developing strategy. So I think does not want to work. So specifically, data can be used definitely for creating strategy development, for benchmarking, for looking at industry analysis. So trying to figure out where does an organization sit in an industry. Data can be used internally to figure out who is and who makes up your organization. Data can be used to figure out where it is that you sit as an organization in comparison to other organizations, or in my case, other institutions. And so one of the things that happens in my unit and workplace culture is we are in charge of labor relations. And one of the things that we look at in one of the portfolios in labor relations portfolio is how many people do we have that are at OCADU? How many students do we have? How many faculty do we have? How many student workers do we have? What is the makeup of those individuals? What type of background or education do they come with? What does their salaries look like? What does the benefits that we provide to them look like in comparison to other universities? So that when we get back to our bargaining table with our collective agreements as part of our labor relations facet, we leverage that data to determine kind of how we want to move forward with the processes that we're looking for, or the proposals that we put forward in labor relations. The same thing when it comes to looking at organizational reviews. So again, another portfolio that fits underneath my team's portfolio is looking at our organization and looking at who we have that makes up OCADU, to look at not just the numbers, but the type of work that's being done. Where does that sit in other organizations? That's also data that we capture. So for instance, I'm in the university sector, but if I was in the college sector, if I worked at George Brown, it's the same thing that would happen there. If I look at George Brown, if I look at Humber College, if I look at Seneca, it would really just say, based on the numbers of administrators that I have in George Brown as an example. So let's say I have 100 folks that are doing administrative work. What does that look like in the sector? What does that look like if I was sitting at Humber College? Do I have 100 people? And then how many people am I serving? And then the same thing if I was looking at Seneca. And so we collect data to be used and leveraged in various sets of ways. But the question is like, what type of data are we collecting and how are we collecting this data? One of the tools that I love to use with my team is a tool or an organization that's called AIHR. And if any of you are in the HR field or just interested in learning about human analytics, they have some really great resourcing on LinkedIn or on their own websites that really walk you through this. And I thought, instead of me recreating this deck or this material around data analytics, I figured I would just show you the picture of what it is that they have provided for us. And so when we look at things like data analytics, this is exactly what I would be doing if I was looking to identify the type of data that my team would be collecting. There are 4 categories with data. We've got descriptive analytics, which is really about the history. It's about how do we get to where we are today. And my team will tell you that is their number one discontent, I'm going to say. Anytime they have a conversation with me, I'm always asking us, what did the history tell us about the situation? When I look at things like grievances, so if I look at, and for anybody that's not in the HR world, if there are issues within labor, people have the opportunity to raise that we have been in breach, or we have not done things according to our collective agreement, which is kind of what holds us as an employer accountable to the folks that work with us, for those that are in unionized positions. And so we usually want to go back and see, well, how did we land to where we got to? So there's the descriptive analytics, which tells a story about what has happened. Quite often we are asked to look at trends, to talk about, in 20, in say in 2010, what was our head count, or how many staff members did we have? And then what did that look like in 2010? What does that look like in 2020? What does that look like today? And so really looking at what has happened and telling us a story, or building a story, then we would look at the descriptive analytics, which is the history. The second piece, which is super important for us, is being able to do the predictive analytics. So it's the what will happen. So quite often people will come to our teams and ask us really to explain or examine what would happen if everybody won the lottery at OCADU and left. What would that do to our workforce? What would happen, if we had a reduction in the amount of students that we had that were part of the university? What would happen to our workforce? What happens if 50% of our female population, or those that identify as being female, or even actually even our male population, those that identify as being male, decided to go off on parental leave? What would happen if we needed to reduce our workload by 50%? So if we needed to not necessarily reduce the number of folks that work with us, but if we need to reduce the type of work that they need to do, what would happen if? And so that's really what we use the predictive analytics, predictive data to do. The third one is really about the diagnostics, which is why did it happen? And so quite often we will look at things like, or actually right now, I can tell you what's happening right now is we look at trends on retirements and we're like, oh, why do we have some gaps in positions or in areas that we shouldn't have? How do we get here? Well, we got here because a lot of these folks or some folks were hired at the exact same time. They're now, some of them are, a lot of them are approaching retirement or will be approaching into retirement at the same time. And there are going to be gaps in our organization. And so really looking at the diagnostics to be like, why, like, where did we get there and how did this happen and why did this happen? Particularly around, if I was to bring in around diversity, equity, inclusion stats, uh, you know, people will ask us, well, we have increased racialized employees, say by 30% in the last 3 years. But why is that we have not been able to increase our Indigenous employees or representation of Indigenous employees in our organization, even though we've upped it by 30%? Like, why did that happen? And so we'd be able to go back and use analytics and use data to be able to confirm what that story looks like. So maybe it's we didn't have enough of applicants into a particular job pool or function, or the workforce or labor data tells us that there are not enough graduates in a particular function or role, and therefore that has really made our applicant pool in our recruitment process to be a little bit smaller, and therefore as a result we haven't been able to hire our target, which was 30%, a 30% increase in, let's say, Indigenous applicants, or it could be Black applicants, or it could be a person with disability, or a person or intersectional crosses between various areas that are underrepresented. So that's how we use the data analytics. The fourth section is prescriptive analytics. And what is that really is like, how can we make something happen? And so I don't know about any of you, but I can tell you anytime my executive team comes to me, and I'm pretty sure it's anytime your teachers, your faculty or your teachers come to you and say, we're going to do this, the first question is, but we can't. I don't know how. And so that's basically what we use prescriptive analytics. It's really about how can we make something happen. So somebody will come to our area with a problem or with an idea, and rather than doing what human nature does first, which is we cannot do this, we actually try to use the data or leverage the data that we have to create data models, which I'm really bad at, but something that somebody else in the institution is really good at, to create data models to talk about how can we make this happen. So if I was to an example would be if I needed to maintain a certain budget of full-time staff, as an example, and I need to hire, let's say, 3 more people, and I have a fixed budget of $100,000 to do this, to maintain my budget for the year. Predictive analytics will allow for me to then be able to determine how can I get those 3 additional people without actually creating an impact to my budget line. So is it that I have somebody that is potentially going to, potentially is going to go on parental leave? Or do I have somebody that potentially is going to retire in the next year, where I can then hire somebody on a short-term contract? Or I can use predictive analytics, say, over the next 5 years. I think if I was to go back to the example that I use for diagnostic analytics, which is about the retirement pieces, it's like, okay, fine. If I'm going to have people be retiring, let's say I'm going to have 10% of my workforce retire in the next 5 years, I can use predictive analytics, say to my executive team, hey, well, we can't hire those folks right now without changing the budget. But if we are strategic, we have 2 people leaving next year. We've got 4 people leaving the following year. We've got 8 people leaving the following year. And so we can bring in additional resources or people to fill in for those roles without actually impacting or changing the budget. So that's kind of what we use these particular 4 types of data, or potentially could use for those pieces. So it's not just about, or the journey about using data is really not just about the leveraging of data or understanding the 4 types of data that we have. It's also about ensuring the fact that you have a process in place to use this data. So AI HR, as I said, has done a really good job. And so I wasn't going to reinvent the wheel. I leverage what they had out there, which is the five actions and same process that we take in here for our data journey. And that is really asking the question, like, what are we trying to do? So usually when somebody comes to me and they say, Kerry-Ann, I have an issue in my team. We don't have the skill sets, as an example. We don't have the skill sets in order to get something done. The question, I start asking them is, but how are we going to acquire those skill sets? Are we going to acquire them by bringing in somebody that's new? Are we going to retrain them? Do we have a trend of folks that are coming in? And so I start asking all these questions, but it's part of my questions that I'm going to be asking my business partners are not just about how to fill the role, but really looking at, where this role is going to take them in the future. And so although that particular instance might just be a question of they're looking to recruit for something. I'm always asking additional data questions, thinking about not just about the request that's coming in, but also about the institution as a whole or the organization as a whole. And so we really do, in our role as HR professionals, or at least my role as an HR professional, is to ask really relevant business questions and to dig a little bit deeper, to really thinking about the data selection. So where am I going to be collecting the data from? So in our case, it's really about understanding our employee population. So who makes up OCADU? What type of resources or people do we have that work here? Are they working here full time? Are they working here part time? Are they what type of socio-demographic do they make up? What type of educational factors do they have? Who are they from a demographics or an equity lens standpoint? So really thinking about what type of data it is that we're trying to collect, what type of data are we trying to select is really now looking at who are we going to go out to collect that data. So there are certain things that we would collect from our full-time staff that we would not collect from our part-time staff and vice versa. And so just being able to really understand who it is that we need to engage with in order to leverage or collect the data. That's it, at least as far as I'm concerned, those are the easy parts. Then comes the data cleaning. So you've gone out there and you've done employee engagement survey as an example that talks about how it is the organization is, or how people feel in the organization, or you go out there and you collect data on, say, it could be on race-based data to understand who from a equity lens perspective, represents OCADU, or in your case, it would be in George Brown. And so then it's great to collect the data. I don't know how many of you have collected data and then looked at your data set and you're like, ooh, there's a lot of data here. And the data itself needs to be either cleansed, or it needs to be masked, or it needs to be updated because people didn't interpret the questions the way that you thought that they would interpret them and the way that you've written them. And so again, there is a huge amount of responsibility into doing the data cleansing and data cleaning. The next step after that is the analysis of the data. So once you've now cleansed your data, you then want to start analyzing it, really digging a little bit deeper to understand what is the data trying to tell you. And then the final step of that is really about the actionable insights. And that is, people have been so kind to provide you with data, or to fill out your survey, or to fill out a questionnaire that you've sent them, or to provide you with their profiles on recruitment when you're recruiting them. The actionable insights is actually what are you doing with data and being able to go back out to the community and show them that you're using it. So an example could be, actually, an example here at OCADU is we knew that we had various employees that wanted to create employee resources groups. We call them ERGs, where folks that have an affinity to a certain background will be able to join into a group as an affinity group. And so, but the question is that we didn't know was who and where. Where do they sit in the institution? What does that look like? What departments are they a part of? What roles are they in? And figuring out how to bring them together, and then also trying to figure out when can we bring folks together. And so the actual insights allow for you to do that. So one of the things that we were able to do was we were able to go out to our community and say, we're interested in having these employee resources groups to be started, are you interested in participating in it? And do you self-identify as being one of these particular categories? So whether it was LGBTQ plus QIA, whether it was, or 2S QIA, whether it was somebody that self-identifies as being Black or from the Caribbean, or somebody that self-identifies as being Indigenous. So we went out and we asked a bunch of questions, and the folks were able to A, tell us kind of who they were, but also B, tell us if they're even interested in making this ERG. And I will say, although we hope to have more than we have today, right now we've established 2 employee resources groups or hubs based on the data that we were collected. So again, being able to leverage and use your insights as you move forward. So the types of data that we can collect. So I've been giving examples of different types of data that we would collect, but here are some of the other ones that we could use. We can use data sources such as in our recruitment, and something that's near and dear to my heart is learning management, and our succession planning, and how people are learning. Employee survey data, which is kind of what I was just saying. We make sure that everybody that comes in, we encourage everybody that comes into our institution for them to complete an employee survey an employee survey that would provide us with data that tells us who makes up the fabric of OCAD-U. Looking at certain demographics, looking at jobs, so the types of jobs that we have, looking at things like talent development, looking at travel, who's traveling, looking at performance management, which is one of my favorite ones, which tells me about kind of how people are performing. Are they getting the supports that they need? Are there gaps or issues or barriers for certain groups that are either underrepresented and marginalized? Are we getting grievances? In my case, labor relations is huge. Are we getting grievances or performance issues for certain areas? Looking at things like compensation and benefits. So like I had said to you before, we do a lot of jurisdictional scanning with other institutions to see where we are on our compensation lines. Looking at things like exit interviews. So again, when people leave the institution, why are they leaving? Are they leaving because they don't like the job anymore? Are they leaving because it's not a fit, because they found a new job? And so that data allows for us to start talking about our trends. Things like mentoring and coaching, and looking at who's using mentoring and coaching. Things like absences, so who is not showing up for work, and for whatever, and what reasons are they not showing up for work? So looking at employee absence data, looking at things like financials, so overall financial health of a unit or of the institution. Sales, I don't use sales, but some people do. Looking at sales parameters as well. So somebody, if you were in an organization, such as one of my favorites, which is Starbucks or Tim Hortons, and you need to do staffing levels. Like you look at your sales data in order to tell you how many people you should have on shift based on that predictive analysis. So again, these are the different types of data that you can utilize or that can be captured. And so that also tells a story to an institution or an organization as they move forward when they're looking at their data. And so it's good to know kind of the different types of data that can be captured. And we'll go a little bit deeper about, equity in data. But one of the things that we talk about when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, that we need to think about when collecting data or even when utilizing our data is the barriers that exist in having institutions be equitable, be diverse, and be inclusive. And so outside of just collecting the data, we need to make sure that there are structures that are in place that really allow for us to take that data that we've collected, that rich, valuable insights, and be able to leverage it to use to improve on the workplace or the policies, or the procedures or practices that make up the workplace or the institution that you're in. And so these are the 3 areas in which we really want to make sure that we are building inclusive strategies, and we're leveraging the data that you've collected in order to do so. One of them is things like looking at policies, practices, and procedures. And when I say policies, practices, and procedures, policies are things like your attendance policy, and looking at how your attendance policy may create a barrier to somebody that is a person that has a disability, or requires an accommodation needs. We were just talking about this the other day. We have a bereavement leave policy of somebody. So if somebody unfortunately has somebody that passes away in their family, our policy itself allows for somebody to be away for up to 3 days. And that sounds really great. And it is a fantastic policy to have. It's a great process to have. But the challenge is if you need to go someplace, let's say you need to go to a funeral that is in Africa or that is in India or in China, the 3 days is not enough to cover that. And so what other practices and procedures can we put in place that allow for us to have a equitable and diverse workforce that keep people attracted to come and work here at OCADU? What can we put in place in order for us to still have a policy that says 3 days, but then have a practice and a procedure that says that it has an exemption, for folks that have to travel further. And so those are things that we talk about, really looking at our policies and being like, how do those policies that we have or the practices that we have, how do they potentially create barriers to diversity, equity, inclusion? And in those places and spaces where we can eliminate some of those barriers, why don't we do so? And the only way for us to do that is to collect the data in order to provide evidence-based decision making or evidence-based advisory for us to really look at our policies and our practices to make sure that they are as inclusive and equitable as possible, which will then also ideally make our institution as diverse as possible. The second one is really looking at things like resource allocation, culture, and identity. And that what that really means, I know it's big words, what it really means is who makes up the institution that we are in? What type of a culture are we trying to have? Is it an inclusive culture? Is it an exclusive culture? Do we have cliques? Do we have a safe or brave space work environment? Who from an identity perspective uh, is in our organization, and how welcoming is our organization to those to everybody. And so being able to look at our data to see who are we hiring, who are we bringing to the institution, who have we traditionally had here, leveraging that data to talk about who's leaving and why are they leaving. Are they leaving because they don't see anybody else that looks like them on our executive team? Are folks attracted to come and apply to OCADU because we represent places and spaces or identities that they didn't think that would be able to be in academia? I will tell you my own personal experience of that is whenever I walk into rooms as a Black female administrator in a leadership position, a lot of people will double look at me and be like, how did you do that? How did you get there? And it's never a critique about how am I sitting in this job. It's just more about the fact that they were super excited to see somebody in that role that was traditionally held by people that were not women of color. And so, that's how we can leverage some of our data in order to tell a story and to attract people, keep people here, and also have folks, when folks are leaving for whatever reason that they're leaving, ensuring the fact that a barrier was not, or a barrier due to diversity, equity, inclusion was not one of those things. And the other thing that we look at is really about the power dynamics. So again, we know that knowledge is power, data is power. Looking at things like how power is centralized in an institution, who controls the decision-making power, who sits at our executive team tables, who does not, who is part of the conversations when we're talking about things like our workforce or when we are looking at interviewing, who is sitting around that table doing the interviews? And is it the same people that are looking at or that are conducting the interviews over the same time? Are we hiring the same types of folks into the institution? Are we diversifying it? Are we providing the best opportunity that we can? So again, looking at that data and the power dynamics that are put at play is also important for us to actually look at the barriers and how do the people that sit in power, whether we're talking about in positional power or just in institutional power, how does it actually work? Are we having people that all look the same and all go to the same, or that all came up in the exact same school? Like if they all came to work at OCAD, or in your case, if they all worked at George Brown over the last 10 years, are they only hiring, folks that have already worked at George Brown? Or are they only hiring from a particular other institution? Or are they only hiring somebody from a certain demographic within Toronto? Or are they only hiring from people that are part of an affinity group that they are part of? So again, those are some of the things that we want to keep in mind when we're looking at that data piece. And so the definition for a systemic employment barrier is really about workplace culture and human resource management and rules and standards that create a disproportionate exclusion or restricts the participation of groups within the workforce based on factors that are unrelated to the nature of the work or their merits or the ability to do their work, or anything that creates an unfair barrier for them to access the valuable benefits and opportunities based on a prohibited code of ground. And the reason why I want to talk about what a systemic employment barrier is because as I start talking about about biases, this is some of the things that we need to be thinking about. So what do we have in place in our policy that stops or prevents people from being able to have access based on one of the prohibited grounds? Um, and so, which we also refer to as the code. And so if I go to the next slide, it looks at really about the grounds of discrimination, which are things like age, race, color, ancestry, citizenship, ethnic origin, place of origin, creed, disability, family status, marital status, including whether or not somebody is single, gender identity and gender expression, a record of offenses, sex, including pregnancy, breastfeeding, and sexual orientation. So these are all grounds in which the Ontario Human Rights Code says that we cannot, as an employer, discriminate against anybody. And so when I talk about systemic discrimination, and again, taking it back, to 2 slides over, when we talked about our practice and policies, we need to make sure that whatever policies that we're put into place is that we are not infringing on any of these coded grounds. And we can use and leverage our data in order to do that. So which is why we say that, just that collecting employment data for us is super important. In here at OCADU, and I believe the same thing at George Brown College, there are, in our recruitment side of the house, we have the ability under a section on the Human Rights Code to do something which is called a special program. And what a special program says is if you realize that in your recruitment of a particular role, that you do not have enough people that are represented in that particular for that particular coded ground, you can create a special program that allows for you to only hire based on that particular special program. So sometimes you will see ads at our place that say, IBPOC, so Indigenous, Black, and people of color will be prioritized for this position. Or you may see certain language pieces being prioritized. So an example could be, I might not have enough French speaking or bilingual staff. So then we would create a designation that is specifically for French staff, designation that is specifically for a job ad that only, is prioritized or that is prioritizing French speaking folks first. And so again, just understanding kind of where it is that we sit and ensuring the fact that our policies, practice, and procedures do not create that ground of discrimination. And so I have, this is in the chart, you will be getting it, again, just looking, you'll be getting it as part of your deck. So we have the ability to really look at how the scales work between privilege and marginalization. I referred it to back in a couple of slides ago, which is about the power and where does the power traditionally reside. And so on this slide, it really just talks about where privilege in this case referred to as power, who normally or who has traditionally been in a power playing position or a privileged position. And traditionally it's, it is looking at for a race specific piece, it would be somebody that is white over somebody that is racialized that often feels the experience of marginalization more. It doesn't mean that they always do. And I think that's one of the things that we want to get be very careful on when we're analyzing our data is it doesn't mean that because an individual is a part of a marginalized community or is part of an equity deserving community, that they're always going to be marginalized or that all the data sets are always going to tell you that there's this disproportionality or underrepresentation of them in an area. And so, you do need to make sure that you're using that lens when you're creating your data models and when you're looking at analyzing your data. If I go back to the very first slide, to ensure the fact that the data that is telling you exactly what it is that you need to know and that you're looking at that data and you're analyzing data from various sets of lenses. We look at things like ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability. This is a big one that we leverage a lot here is making sure that whatever we do that's employee centric, that there is a reduction in a barrier between somebody that is able-bodied or appears to be able-bodied versus somebody that has a disability or a perceived disability. And so we try to really relook over our policies to ensure the fact that everybody that comes to OCADU has, regardless of their ability or accessibility needs, has a fair employment uh, experience while they're here. Things like citizenship status, socioeconomic status, age. I don't know how many generations it is that we have that are in this room with me, but age is something that's coming up quite often these days. Is that the elder workforce is feeling discriminated against, or they're feeling that we are not hiring them as quickly or as much as we've been doing for the younger generations in the workforce. And so again, making sure that we've been able to collect that data to see it to determine as to whether or not that's actually happening. Again, things like religion and language. And so the question is about that data, like how can systemic barriers be enforced by data, whether it's employee socioeconomic demographic data, the barriers are identified as being policies, practices, cultures, and attitudes. The impacts, though, is things that can happen when we don't have an equitable workforce are things like career stagnation. So people that would come in and they'd be in the same job forever and not be able to move because there is a systemic barrier, again, attached to one of the coded grounds as to why they haven't been able to do that. So quite often in organizations, you will see that the racialized administrative staff, as an example, trends have shown that they stay in these administrative positions longer than, say, somebody that is non-racialized or that is white, regardless of their gender. And so being able to look at those types of trends and again collecting that data to tell us, who is career stagnant, looking at things like low promotion rates. Again, it's another barrier. Looking at workforce representation, so having low workforce representation by having individuals, again, that being able to collect that data will tell us or let us know kind of like the impacts of how our policies, practice, procedures, cultures, and attitudes have impacted us. Looking at things like organizational processes. And so I talked a little bit about fair hiring and being able to leverage special hiring practices, looking at respectful workplace. So again, looking at our data to see who is in our workplace, how are they being treated? Do they feel like they are being seen, valued, and heard? Looking at things like job fit, again, leveraging that data that we collect to see whether or not somebody is in a job and it's the right job for them. Are we giving them development opportunities? Are we giving them training? Are they leaving or exiting the institution because we haven't been paying attention to some of the barriers they would be facing. And so, one of the questions that when we talk about job fit that I've always asked my team is, can you look back at a trend and say, if we have an area that is always where we're always looking to hire into, that tells me that there is an issue in that area. And the question is, but why? What exactly is the issue that's happening there? And is it the same type of people that are leaving? Are they, of a same ethnic background, or are they from a same educational level? Are they from a same city? Like whatever the case may be. So again, just really having an understanding to be able to look at the data and analyze that. And so that's kind of how we leverage data in our processes. And then the next phase is really about data collection and looking at the barrier process and process that we have in place. So this is where I know I've been talking for a long time. This is where I'm hoping that you all would be able to tell me in the chat where or what do you think would be some barriers that would come into collecting the data? If I can get one or two folks to just type it in for me. What would stop an organization from being able to collect data? Or why wouldn't you share your data? Employee privacy. Yeah. Uh, Videhe, I might have said your name wrong. If I did, I apologize. So please feel free to correct me. Yeah, employee privacy is a big one. Um, I've had a lot of folks that have put in, or when we've asked them to share their data, they're like, "Who's going to see the data? Is my boss going to see this?" Okay. And so my next question is, what type of data do you think your organization should collect and why? And I already gave you some of them. Nobody wants to tell me? Okay. Feedback. Yeah, no. Thank you for taking a leap of faith, Vidya. That is exactly what it is. What type of data? They should definitely collect feedback about an employment journey, and what does that actually mean, and how do people feel there. The other things that we should be collecting again is stuff that I've been talking about, like who makes up our organization. Organizations also to be collecting data around who is using the services in an organization to make sure they're represented. So I'm not sure how many of you have completed surveys at George Brown College to talk about that ask you for your demographic data. One of the things that we like to do here at OCAD is we try to collect that data to make sure that our faculty population represent our student population. So thank you, and thank you for contributing. Okay, so 100% employee privacy, I think Vidihe had said, is barrier. So barriers to data collection is definitely fear and mistrust. So how's the data going to be used? Lack of tools to collect the data. Um, I know, there's different tools that people can leverage, but not all the tools that we have are going to provide you with the information insight that you're going to be looking for. And data collection tools are and sometimes expensive. We use a lot of surveying tools around here. That's how we collect our data. Not having enough, not using the data. So again, we have something which we call survey fatigue, where we collect data, we don't actually use it, and people are like, "Why are you coming back out and asking me for this data again? It's never been used." And so that quite often happens in an institution, and then not using the data, or there's no change. And so people will be like, well, I gave you this data last year and you haven't improved my employee experience. And so I'm not going to complete your survey again this year. Some of the other factors so we talked about the factors for collecting data. Next is the processes, and we talked about this a little bit in my very beginning kickoff. So why would we collect data? We collect data to engage with our staff members. In this case, we collect a lot of race-based data as our background, because we want to make sure that our student population reflects the faculty and the administrative population that we have. And so we use that for engagement. We engage with various communities in order to understand kind of who makes up OCADU, understand what their interests are. So what are they interested in moving or shifting the organization? What's working well, what isn't? We look at setting objectives. So again, ensuring the fact that if we are collecting data, why are we collecting the data? We're not just collecting data because we can, we're collecting it because we actually have a need to do so. It's looking at creating and making sure the fact that we understand how we're going to analyze our data. It's making sure that we have policies, procedures that are set up in advance, that have clear roles and responsibilities, that tells about who's going to have access to the data, how often are they going to have access to data, what are they using and leveraging the data for, which is the data collection, management, and security. So again, it allows for folks that are wondering about the privacy of the data, who has access to what. Looking at monitoring, so again, establishing ongoing monitoring practices about using that data. Looking at compliance and support, so delivering training and providing resources. One of the various keys to this is really about being able to not only collect the data, but it's about being able to use it. So we make a lot of assumptions that people know how to read and leverage and interpret data to create a policy. It doesn't actually mean that way. And so therefore we have to just make sure that we are actually looking in and we provide training to our staff on how to use the data, and then providing them resources in order to analyze that data as they move forward. And so one of the things that needs to go out before you collect any data is really about the notice of collection. And so again, just making sure that we tell people why we're collecting the data, how much time is going to be needed to participate in collecting the data, ensuring the fact there's confidentiality procedures, so things about reporting, storing the data, who is going to have access, linking. So if you're going to link data from one data set collection to another, that you're going to be able to let folks know that this is what we're doing. And so an example of how I would do that in HR is if I was linking my employee experience data with my actual unit makeup, so knowing who is in my units and connecting them by ethnicity or race or by other sociodemographic factors, that we'd be able to do that and link them, but we'll have to let them know that we're actually going to be doing that or if I was to link my employee IDs as an example with my sociodemographic data so that people are aware of it ahead of time, that we'd be able to track them for various purposes and to use that data as we look to improve our employment experience. And again, providing opportunities for people to be able to ask questions as to how we're going to be using their data. And so if there's anything that you take away from today, it's really about the need to protect people's data. So making sure that you have some type of a personal protection and management of their information. It's implementing things, processes for quality assurance, is looking at security systems. So again, making sure that you lock down access data. If somebody has been, willing enough to provide you with the data, you need to ensure that we're actually being able to leverage it for only the needs that have been asked for, and that we're getting rid of it as soon as possible if we don't need the access to information anymore. Making sure that personal information that is stored in electronic databases, and that there are passwords that are attached to that. You shouldn't have people's data just flying around in pieces of paper. And then again, limiting the access to who has access to personal data. So an example could be in our area, our labor relations data. We don't have, there's two people that have access to it. And so we don't allow for folks to go poking around in people's employment files. And so when we talk about, finally, is really about the bias and data collection and analysis. And so it's great for us to collect the data, but the question is like, what are some of the things that we need to think about when we're collecting the data? So we think about historical practices and social biases. So again, when we're looking at our data, we need to look at how is it we're collecting it and how are we going to judge it? I don't know how many of you have looked at data sets or have looked at something and made a conclusion without really checking about what biases do I bring to the table. So again, I don't know how many folks during the pandemic had heard it. It was one of the big, I think it was one of the big electronics firms. I can't remember which one it was. And they had said, we can't diversify our workforce because we can't find any racialized folks to work for us. The question is not that they couldn't find anybody that was qualified, it was they actually weren't looking. And the question was, where were they going to do recruitment for it? And so again, understanding how do our prejudices and biases actually impact the data collection process and the data analysis practice, and being very clear that you as an individual are very aware of your own biases and how it is that you're interpreting your data, but also how you're collecting the data. And ensuring the fact that you, as you're coding, for those of you that are coders on this call, as you're coding your surveys or as you're coding your analytics pieces, that you're really paying attention to how will this data be utilized and read by the folks that will be getting the data once we have collected it. And so to mitigate that, you really want to make sure that you have a diverse and representative data collection. You want to make sure that you've built in transparency and accountability, and that you have some strategies in place to detect when there is bias and how to correct it. And I think I touched about this before, is especially when we're talking about race-based data, it is super important, or equity-based data, that you go through when you run various scenarios so that you can ensure the fact that you did not have any biases or embedded biases into your coding or into your practices, to ensure that you are actually, as part of your data cleansing practice, that you are able to analyze the data in a way that is as unbiased as possible. Not saying that it will not have biases, of course it will, but trying to mitigate that and rerunning scenarios to ensure as much as possible that you've eliminated those where you can. I was going to have you run the matching exercise. I'm actually not going to have you do it because I am quickly running out of time. But one of the things that we like to do is really talk about the things that are important when we look at our data collection expertise. This is part of your deck, so you can do it there. We want to look at data masking, so making sure that when we're collecting the data, if we're giving it out to folks to analyze it and to look at it, that don't need to have access to it, that we have masked it, which really means that we have de-identified it so that folks can't particularly say, well, Kerry-Ann, you said this. We want to remove data when it's not important. Again, when it comes to data generalization, where we can, when it makes sense to, you can just group some data together and generalize and make a generalized assumption about whatever it is that you're trying to do. You want to look at your coding practices. You want to ensure the fact that that you are creating data samples. You want to make sure that when you're looking at your data sets, that you are running scenarios that swap out your data, and that you want to make sure that your data is distributed depending on what it is that you're looking at, that there is some type of data distribution. And so you can do this exercise later. I will provide you with the right marks to talk about kind of how you'd actually be able to do that. And then finally, I will leave this one for you to watch, and that is the Public Service Commission has a video on how they have actually utilized data in their employee data sets to predict or to work through their employment composition. And so there's a quick 5-minute video, which I will not show today, but please, I encourage all of you to take a look at to how they've leveraged data or through their staffing dashboard in order to ensure that the public service that the federal public service has is representative of the people of Canada. And so finally is looking at the workforce culture data. So again, I talked a little bit about how I leverage data in my team and what we use to report on. So here are some of the things that we use to report on here, and embedding that equity is looking at things like our faculty members, our sessionals, the types of teaching assistants we have, our administrative staff that are the two different bargaining agents that we use, looking at who our non-accredited instructors are, looking at things like our turnover types, so resignations, retirements, termination, layoffs, end of contracts, and unfortunately those that are deceased, looking at things like our leave types of sick term, short term, and long term leave, looking at people that are under on a leave of absence, and looking at things like maternity and paternal leave. And so being able to leverage the data set that we've collected, again, put it also using a diversity, equity, inclusion lens, which is, is there a change or shift in who is terminated based on a race or based on ethnicity or based on culture or based on their educational background? Is there an overrepresentation of somebody that has been denied a leave of absence based on any of these coded grounds? And so just being able to really analyze that information and bring us to provide valuable insights to our executive team. And with that, I think I am done. I am going to take some questions. I deeply apologize for not having to engage in something more robust, but I hope each of you was able to glean some insights on how diversity, equity, inclusion can be leveraged in data analytics.
Thank you, Kerry-Ann. It was such an valuable insights, like starting from how the diversity was embraced in hiring to have a respectful workplace. We gained a lot of insights. We also get to know like how the bias was mitigated in data collection and everything. So I would like to hand over to Ayaroslav for the Q&A. I hope he's having some questions.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Kerry, for this presentation. It was really insightful, really engaging, and very informative. And I especially like your presentation, your slides presentation. I think it was just doing the job of drawing attention to what is being said. So thank you very much for that. And now on to the questions, because we really want to turn this into a conversation. So my first question from all of us would be, where do you see this area in 5 years? How do you see it develop within the 5 years, from your experience, from the trends you've been seeing? What do you think is going to happen?
I think the more people see how we're leveraging this data for the better and for the good, they'll be more willing to provide it with us, and then we'll be able to leverage it to do some amazing things, from right down from recruitment from institutions. So from George Brown as an example, if I could look at my analytics data and realize the fact that I don't have enough students that I'm hiring into the institution or into government, as an example, that are coming out of George Brown, then I will be able to create a filter or be able to create a program that provides a filter into my organization. And so I think it's really about not just about how do we collect the data or getting people to trust to show us the data, but demonstrating how it's being leveraged and used. And I think with the incorporation, and I didn't talk about AI at all, but AI will also be able to allow for us to do that. So from the minute somebody says, I'm applying for this job, I can watch the trajectory throughout their entire job process and hopefully be able to see kind of where it is, at least in my field, where are those biggest barriers, or who isn't being hired, or who isn't being represented. And not only am I bringing them in, but who isn't progressing, who isn't getting training, who isn't getting development, and who isn't showing up in leadership. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it perfectly does. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. And due to the fact that we have not so much time left, I will actually prioritize other folks here and ask if anybody has questions. So guys, please, if you have any questions for Kerry, please go ahead and ask. I will give you this opportunity now. You can use the chat, or you can just jump on your microphone and speak.
And I will be happy to hang around because I deeply apologize because I was late. So.
That's okay. I think it was worth it every minute. Guys, do you have any questions? Otherwise, I will proceed if nobody has any questions. Well, in this case, I don't see any questions in the chat.
I'm just curious about one question. So, we saw that you have driven several initiatives for the anti-racism and to include a foster inclusive environment. So, could you share any of your personal experience, like any of the initiative you have taken so far, and how did it went?
Yeah, I will be quite honest. Some of the things that and again, it's about, for us, it's really about leveraging that data set. So even right now, as an example, I am hiring. My team right now is predominantly female. And so I am very conscious of that, not saying the fact that I'm not going to hire another female onto our team, but I'm asking my team to also pull and pay special attention to folks that have other identities or intersectionality. So if they are Indigenous and male, or if they are a person with, sorry, and I should say, and able-bodied is on my team. If they are, a person that has a disability and they are racialized, like trying to really look at prioritizing those types of candidates in the work and in the roles that we have so that we can fulfill our needs here. But it's happened in certain different ways. I also look at things like professional development opportunities. My question is always like, who is getting professional development funds, or who is getting, I think I referred to a little bit earlier, Amanda, like who has applied to, take a professional development course, and who are we approving those courses and who are we denying? And being able to, if I have employment data, I'll be able to see where the trends are. And I'll be able to see, okay, so fine, are we not spending money on a particular marginalized group? Or is it only one group that's going to be getting access to X, Y, and Z? And the same thing when I look at things like performance. And so I'll talk about my previous role when the Ontario Public Service was really around anti-racism. When we looked at who was getting mentorship opportunities and who wasn't getting mentorship opportunities, again, being able to leverage that employment data to be able to see, that we had a disparity where there are certain groups that are, coming out of certain areas of government that were getting mentorship opportunities, and they were actively getting mentorship opportunities versus those that didn't have access to that. And I want to be clear, it doesn't always need to be race-based. It doesn't always need to be about race-based sociodemographics, or even some of the demographics that I showed that are code-based grounds. It could be anything. I tell people, I used to laugh at folks in the public service, because one of the things that I would say is, if you want to move into management, you need to work at Treasury Board Secretariat, TBS, which is like the centralized piece, because it seemed like anybody that worked in that particular area would for sure be in a management job position within 5 or 10 years. And so it was kind of like, okay, like they were the brainchild of the organization. And so again, when I say leveraging the data to really tell you a story, that's where it becomes really important.
Thank you for your answer. And I have one more question. How important, in your opinion, are training and education when it comes to fostering and creating an inclusive and diverse workplace? And if so, what should it include? What should it entail, in your opinion?
In my research, how about my team's opinion? It's not necessarily my opinion. They will totally love this. So when it comes to fostering an inclusive workforce, it's on two folds. Every individual here has a responsibility, no matter who it is that you are, to educate yourself on the different aspects of diversity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And understand the fact that although you may be a member of a particular demographic or a particular group, it doesn't mean that you have the same experiences, the same lived experiences of that group. And so we all have a duty and responsibility to do that type of research. Organizations also have a responsibility to ensuring the fact that we provide resources. So it could be pointing folks to different training programs, or it could be, engaging in conversations like this about diversity, equity, inclusion. It could be about having listening circles. Yesterday was the day of National Truth and Reconciliation. So again, making sure that, our employees are not just sitting at home shopping for the day, making sure that we are running programming and encouraging folks to come in to learn about the 92 calls to action, understand kind of how the institution is moving it forward. It really is it's an ownership of all of us to move things forward and to learn, and to also they are courageous conversations, right? Whenever you talk to somebody about race, ethnicity, disability, ability, language, like that's personal. And so I always say to folks, like, we need to approach these conversations with care and kindness and with values, and with respect, and understand that we're not always going to see things happen, or we're not always going to be able to um, see various situations from the same lens, but it doesn't mean that we can't have a respectful conversation about it. We can always agree to disagree. And don't get me wrong, especially when it comes and I will go there when it comes to, conflict in the Middle East. I might talk to one colleague and they, of a certain descent, and talk to the same colleague of the exact same descent, and they may have a different opinion about what's happening or how things are being impacted. So again, just making sure that we are meeting people where they are at, and we are trying to provide as much of an open space, but also a space where we're okay to walk away from these conversations. And it's okay to have to put a pin in it and not continue it, because at the end of the day, if your conversation is going to do harm to somebody else, that is not the conversation to be had. And so it takes your own internal, I'm going to say gut instinct, but it also takes reading the room, and then understanding the fact that there are so many things that we don't know. And I don't think I include in the notes, but I'll make sure I do send it. There's a really great assessment was done at Harvard. It talks about our biases, and so that I think is a good starting point for folks to understand when you're heading into a conversation that you think may already be a triggering or harmful conversation. They understand kind of where it is that your biases are, your bias set, or where you're coming from, because that may change how does you approach the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's such a multifaceted answer, actually, and I think that sort of reflects the complexity of the issue, right? And I think we have one more question just in the chat, so I will read it to everybody else. So, could you please explain again a little bit more about how data analytics can help create personalized inclusion programs for different employee groups?
Yeah. No, it's not on my wall anymore. I was going to say I have it on my wall, but it's not there. So our data will tell us kind of who makes up our employee groups. So whether we have Indigenous employees, whether we have Black employees, whether we have somebody from the Middle East, whether we have English, I would call it English as a second language speaking employees, whether we have folks that want to talk about pedagogy as an example. I'll throw it out there because it's something that came in our employee resourcing group. Are things people wanted to talk about. And so again, you'd be able to create these safe spaces for folks to be able to have these conversations, or to figure out kind of what their needs are. One of the things that, and you guys can't tell my provost this, but one of the things that came out in our survey was for new mothers. We ran a couple of data surveys for folks that were coming back off of leave, whether from a leave of absence, from parental leave, or maternity leave, and or just a generic, health leave. And one of the things that they said is they came back and they didn't feel like they were being supported. So one of the things that we're looking to do is to create an employee resource group where those folks can feel supported, whether it's a peer mentoring group, whether it is just a check-in with them that we wouldn't have done normally, to just make sure that they are adjusting well, or accumulating well, being able to do some more we'll call them targeted focus groups to see whether or not once they've been back in the institution, say for 6 months, do they still feel disconnected? Because yes, when I don't know if any of you have any experience when you're embedded, immersed in something, and then you go away from it for a long time, and all of your friends are still there, and or the people that you have been working with are still there, and they are still continuing on with their life, and you come back and you feel like you're left out. And that's kind of what has been happening, unfortunately for some of our folks who have been on leave, is they've been coming back and they feel like everybody else has moved on and they are left behind. And so trying to be able to close that gap and trying to find innovative ways that are going to do that aren't my ways. Because just because I might think that, having meeting at a bar as an example is a great place to for us to always congregate at, it doesn't mean that that's how that works for the individuals coming back from leave or a place that they want to go to, right? They may have, especially if they come back from a maternity or paternity leave, they are going to want to be going home to their families, or maybe they are, working fully remotely. Then me saying that I'm going to have employee meeting or a group at a bar isn't going to meet their needs. It's still going to further alienate them. So being really intentional about collecting the data so that we can create programs and policies and practices that address them and meet them where they are at, so that they feel that they are included or more included, or are able to return back to the institution and feel like this is normal for them.
Yeah, thank you for answering. Yeah, it's a perfect answer. Thank you for answering the question. But we do greatly appreciate your coming today and sharing this information with us. Thank you for taking your time out of your day and being with us today. And I hope everybody have had a great time and have learned something. Everybody has learned something today. So we do appreciate your participation. All the folks out there, and we do appreciate you coming today, Kerry. It was such an amazing presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I hope you give folks feedback, because feedback is super important. If we're talking about data, we can't talk about data without feedback.
Yeah.
Amazing.